Penguin Random House Audio presents No Traveler Returns by Louis L'Amour and Beau L'Amour. Read for you by Scott Brick. Preface and afterword read by Beau L'Amour.
For my father, finally.
Fate is a ship, a steel gray lovely bark, or a tanker, westbound.
Preface by Beau L'Amour. Over the years, I have come to realize that it is impossible to comprehend my father's life without understanding the brief time he spent as a merchant sailor. Though he was born in North Dakota and wrote this novel while living on a small farm in Oklahoma, his adulthood was formed and his character was determined by the sea, an environment that must have been exciting, threatening, and wonderful to a kid from the upper Midwest. The sea gave him access to the world. It allowed him to visit England, Japan, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Arabia, Egypt, and Panama, all in a time when few people from the United States ever made it to either Mexico or Canada. He traveled in the roughest of conditions and with the roughest of men. Yet their world was quite a cosmopolitan place, full of different races, religions, languages, philosophies, histories, and governments. It was a far cry from the narrow confines of the small-town America where Louis grew up. The least educated of his siblings, the sea, and the places it took him, became his university. By the 1930s, having settled in a spot that was about as far as one could get from any ocean or foreign country, he began to write about the times, people, and places he had once known. Many of these stories are included in the collection Yondering. Some of them, like Thicker Than Blood, were lifted directly from Louis's life and experience. Others, like Glorious Glorious, are almost certainly pure fiction, but they captured the times in a more realistic manner than the high-adventure style of his pulp stories. Beyond simply attempting to entertain and connect a reader to the life he had once known, No Traveler Returns might also have been my father's way of dealing with certain issues that had been on his mind in the few years prior to beginning this manuscript. First and foremost, No Traveler Returns is, in a sense, an homage to a time gone by, and perhaps a wistful acceptance that he was no longer the young man who had gone to sea a decade before. He had considered going back. After he had helped his parents move to Oklahoma, Louis discussed returning to the sea full-time, and seriously considered the possibility of becoming a ship's officer. He fantasized about being like Joseph Conrad, a ship's mate and a writer at the same time. However, he put off making a choice, and as he connected more and more with life in Oklahoma, it became less of a possibility. But the sea still called to him. You can feel it in many parts of this story. There was also another, darker question on his mind, a question about a moment when the fickle finger of fate passed him over, touching him lightly before moving on. The story goes like this. While waiting to ship out in the mid-1920s, Louis got a job working standby on a large, modern freighter in the port of San Pedro. A standby seaman does routine jobs like chipping rust and rough painting on a ship while it's in port. In Dad's case, it was a desperately needed job, and one he hoped would turn into something more permanent, a position with the crew on the ship's next voyage, possibly even a career on what seemed like a good ship, a career that could have supported him for years. To his dismay, he did not get the job, and the ship sailed without him. It was never heard from again. According to Louis, only one life ring was eventually discovered. The ship had vanished, almost without a trace. As with many aspects of my father's life, there are several versions of that story. In some, the ship is poetically named the Eclipse. In others, the mate who could have hired Louis seems struck by a premonition of some sort and mysteriously dismisses him in an abrupt and callous manner, possibly saving his life. The oddest variation is one where Louis sees a strange man, almost a ghost or apparition, in the ship's galley, and takes this presence as a warning not to sail with the crew. I can't say I completely believe any of these tales, but I definitely get the feeling from this manuscript that Dad was dealing with something personal that had to do with the dangers that could be found at sea. As history tells us, it wasn't too many years after he started this book that the Merchant Marine, by then part of the war effort, became the service with the highest rate of casualties in America's contribution to World War II. No Traveler Returns has the distinction of being the first novel-length work by Louis L'Amour. There are vague suggestions of other, earlier projects, but there is no way to know if they were completed or what became of them. Whether these were references to magazine novels or novellas, which were essentially just long short stories, is unclear, and what eventually happened to them is a complete mystery. In the days before Xerox machines, and in the career of a writer for whom return postage and carbon paper to make duplicates were a financial challenge, the only copy of a manuscript could go missing very easily. The first indication that Dad was working on this book is a journal entry from June 9, 1938. He mentions that he intends to finish No Traveler Returns tomorrow. Though typically optimistic, he almost certainly was not talking about actually finishing the entire novel. More likely, he meant he was wrapping up the first several chapters to submit to publishers in hopes of getting an advance. Those chapters were quickly rejected by several different companies, but he continued to make more progress, documenting that he had completed further chapters as the months wore on. He continued to juggle his time between this novel and other short story projects which might earn him money much more quickly. It was a time when several different aspects of Louis's professional and creative life were colliding. He was writing the semi-autobiographical Yondering-style stories, of which No Traveler Returns is one, and he was promoting himself as a character similar to the protagonists found within those pages, a self-educated yet blue-collar adventurer and world traveler. He was making a name for himself on the Oklahoma poetry scene and in other local literary circles. And, much more important, he had just begun selling material to the pulps, high adventure and crime stories that were more visceral and melodramatic than his other work. The important word here, however, is selling. The personal adventures and slice-of-life stories earned him little or nothing. Though a number of them received critical acclaim, they were published in literary periodicals with a very limited audience. A few of these periodicals might generously be called prestigious. Most, however, just wanted to seem that way. The pulp sales made Louis actual money, a rare thing in Depression-era Oklahoma. But there were also the issues of pride and self-identity. They might have had lax editorial standards, but pulps were popular and had massive circulation. Louis was 30 years old. He was living with his parents in a house owned by his eldest brother, a successful newspaperman. If he was going to call himself a writer and be taken seriously by the people who were putting a roof over his head, he was going to have to stop talking about it and actually earn some money. So pride, cash, and the pleasure of finally being valued by well-known editors and magazines drove him to write more and more for the pulps, even though he was hoping they would be only a temporary stop on the road to becoming a respected novelist. He rationed his time between one style and another, hoping that both would take off. Louis had a vision for his Yondering material, similar to the one he had for his later Sackett, Talon, and Chantry series. He intended to create a cycle of stories documenting the life he had witnessed in different cities around the world: San Pedro in the 1920s, Shanghai in the 1930s, and Paris in the 1940s. Other stories would examine the ships and crews, the roads and rails that connected these locations. Through these and other stories he had planned, Louis intended to loosely chronicle an era that was vanishing, even as he was experiencing it. A different sort of frontier, one where a man could travel without a passport and see a world that had yet to close its last borders or map its final unexplored places. That era's hobos, itinerant workers, and ship's crewmen lived lives which were in many ways clandestine. They were beneath the nose.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?